What happens when you mix a mystical adventure with the Final Fantasy franchise? I don't really know either, but I do know what happens when a Japanese development company decides to make a game with the American audiences in mind. Today, on Final Fantasy, a retrospective journey with the Professor. The game that I was mentioning would be Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, or Mystic Quest Legend in the European market, and finally, Final Fantasy USA, Mystic Quest in Japan. Now I know that you might be thinking in your head that I said in a previous episode the only Final Fantasy to be developed in the US, but here's the thing. It never happened because I refuse to believe that I could ever make a mistake in any video ever made, and you should do so as well, for I am the all-powerful Buddha! If he was a southerner from Arkansas, and had hair, and tons of sexy red face fuzz. In all honesty, I was confused, and like many, believed that the game was actually developed by the US arms of Squaresoft, though it was actually developed in Japan. But as I said, it was actually focused on the US market and audience during this development. This actually ended up meaning a lot of things, such as they didn't have to edit out religious imagery or any other items that were seen as, well, taboo in the US at the time. Though, more importantly, this also meant a huge change to the gameplay itself. You see, in the world of Final Fantasy IV, the previous game, everything was all pew 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 explosions everywhere, while in Mystic Quest, everything is a lot more... Am I doing something right now? The idea behind the design was that the US audience wasn't very interested in adventuring with an open world, and that we weren't very interested in the more complex battle systems, which overall were not that complex anyway. We wanted things to be more linear and simplistic in their minds. Though, despite all of this, I would say that there were some good items in the game itself as well. I will be covering all of these today. The good, the bad, and the deplorable. Now, in all honesty, there are a few good things within the design of the game, from my point of view. But they are few and far between. The first item is that your weapons have more uses than just in battle. As an example, you might come across a switch, but you don't know how to press it. Well, all you have to do is just slash your sword, because that will work in game logic. You can use axes to chop down trees, bombs to put holes in walls, or even use claws to climb certain walls. This was an aspect of adventuring that hasn't been seen in Final Fantasy since, which I honestly think would be nice to see again. They also added the ability to jump in an RPG. Now, you might think this would have only played into the platforming gimmicks, which I don't really count as platforming since the jump is on an automated rail once you press the button anyway, though you would be mostly right. But you will find that with this newfound ability, this will never happen again. God, get out of my way, old lady, before I skewer you with my massive sword of death plus 20! Jesus! Now that event will be more like, God, get out of my... Oh, wait, I can jump over you, so it doesn't matter. Now, the biggest issues with these items, because yes, these changes were panned by the critics, because those same critics were all like, oh, this is different, I know like different, is that they made the game into kind of a mix between Zelda, Ys, and Final Fantasy. The puzzle solving is Zelda mixed with the jumping aspect of Ys and the combat of Final Fantasy. Now, there is one last thing that I must cover that I honestly feel is a plus to this game. There are no random encounters. Within dungeons, you will actually see the enemy placement of all the monsters and will only engage in battle once you touch them. Then, once you kill them, they are gone until you reload the dungeon by exiting and going back in. This also meant that once you defeated all the enemies within a dungeon, you are free to explore without any interruptions. There was also the possibility that you could find a way around some of the battles and never have to worry about them in the first place. This is a system that wouldn't be seen in a Squaresoft game until the likes of Chrono Trigger and Mario RPG. Now, the lack of encounters might have you asking a question. What about the world map? Well, as I said, there are no random encounters. In this game, the only battles that you get on the world map are in battlegrounds, where you will have a total of 10 battles, and at the end of them you will be rewarded with either money, experience, or all new equipment. The interesting thing is that when you are in a battleground, you can leave between each battle and actually heal up if needed, which makes them really freaking easy. The last item that ends up standing out was the inclusion of enemy weaknesses. Now, don't get me wrong. Weaknesses have always existed in the Final Fantasy series, such as the lightning spell is much more effective against a water enemy than, say, an earth enemy. The thing they added was a weapon-type weakness, such as having plant-type monsters weak to axe-type weapons and flying enemies weak to projectile-type weapons, which introduced a new area of strategy to the Final Fantasy series, which is always an added bonus and a welcome change. I realize that we have already talked a lot about the changes they made in this game so far, but now I get to cut loose with the things that I think are bad changes to the series. First and foremost is the world map and the linear style of the game. Instead of an open world that was displayed in the previous installments of the series, this time it is a rail system. You select a point and go there, which removes part of the fun of an RPG. Sure, it makes it that much easier to know where to go next and how to progress the storyline, but this is nothing more than the game actually holding your hand and leading you along. Yes, I understand that the first game in the series was nothing more than a where the hell do I go and what am I doing game, but they proved that you can give actual direction through normal dialogue of NPCs in Final Fantasy IV. They showed that you don't have to make it so cryptic that you're going to be sitting there wondering what the hell do you do with this ship that you won by killing a bunch of pirates. Final Fantasy IV was clear on where you needed to go and what you needed to do next without being pandering and annoying. But within Mystic Quest, they changed that to it just holding your hand and being pandering and annoying about it. Another one that makes me go, oh, come on, is the spell system. Instead of having a pool of MP to use when casting spells, you actually have a pool of dark, light, and ultimate spells that you can cast before you need to sleep, or to use an item that completely refills this pool for every spell type that is really inexpensive once you can start buying them. Which meant about 1/3 of the way through the game, it was nothing more than spam spell, ends turn, spam spell, wash, rinse, and repeat. Yes, this is similar to the system that Final Fantasy on the NES had, but remember, at the time the biggest inspiration and the biggest thing to compare it to that we had was D&D. But by this time the genre itself had moved past this style, and yes, I admit that it is kind of a personal preference of my own. Then there is the combat system, which is one hell of an Edward Nigma. The battles are easier, but a hell of a lot more annoying. The enemies are overall really weak, and even when they aren't, the spells that you are given are so overpowered, nothing should ever be a threat in this game. In all honesty, other than bosses, you can defeat almost any enemy on the screen with 2 or 3 hits at most. Though, here's the big issue. We all know that status elements are a bad thing, right? But in all honesty, the only one that was really a huge threat was Stone. The others are just a nuisance in Final Fantasy. This is not the case in Mystic Quest. Take for example Confusion. It is not a status element that you can be knocked out of by an attack. It is now a timed element. Unless you can end up curing it with a spell and or an item, each time you are afflicted with it, the effects reset, which means it will last that much longer, and the enemies in this game will spend 90% of their turns attempting to inflict ailments, from either it being stone to confusion and many more. This is how a lot of the times you're going to die in this game. Though even then, by the end of the game, you end up becoming immune to pretty much every status element that there is, which makes the battles even more of a cakewalk and defeats the purpose of amping difficulty through status elements. If you look at the design of this game, you can see that the creators were working against themselves constantly. Though you might be saying, but I thought you said all the enemies are easy to kill, so what's the issue here? Well, hold your horses there, partner. Regardless of what you do, every enemy will be stronger than you in each section you go to, unless you wish to go in and out of previous dungeons that you have cleared for hours on end to gain levels, because the experience pools in these places were made so you wouldn't have to grind, because by the end of each dungeon, you will have gained enough levels to beat any boss that is there if you end up fighting everything that is in the dungeon itself. And after that point, you will not gain enough experience in that previous area to make an actual difference. Which leads me to why the lack of random encounters is also a bad thing. You cannot grind easily, because when you clear a dungeon, you have to leave the dungeon to reset it, which makes it that much harder. Lastly, there is the storyline, which is the biggest flaw according to the critics of the time. Sure, it was your normal Final Fantasy fare. Random guy has to venture the world looking for the 5 MacGuffin crystals. Why is it always Crystal Squaresoft? An effort to restore balance, to the world because the land is dying, the air has stopped, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever since air itself doesn't move, it is wind. The water is drying up, etc. Oh, and there is this whole plot of having to find a girl's missing dad because he didn't realize that parking his boat on the side of a cliff was a bad idea. Then you have to kill the evil monster thing that isn't mentioned until the very end of the game because he is evil and he wants to destroy the world. By the way, the big baddie's name is Dark King. Really freaking original, Square. Why not just call him Evil McDouchenstein next time? This is the issue with the story. There is no build up to anything other than the idiot ship captain who is talked about through the entirety of the game. The final boss comes from nowhere. The scripting is bad, and overall the story seems really insignificant and explains nothing. Let's compare it to Final Fantasy IV. It has a decently long opening, and we learn a lot during it, such as our main character is Cecil. He is a Dark Knight for the country of Baron, and he is the captain of the Red Wings, who is also best friends with Kain, who is a Dragoon and is overly loyal to his king, country, and friends. There is a love interest in the form of Rosa, and a crazy engineer named Sid who built and invented the airships. You also learn of the conflict between Baron and everyone else in the world, and that the king is a massive douche. This all happens before the first actual battle of the game, and you actually take full control of your characters. What do we learn in Mystic Quest? This guy has a sword, that he is some knight of a legend that won't be explained until the very end of the game, and that he might have a name, but we never know it because they never actually say it. His name is Benjamin, by the way. To make it simple, the most important part of an RPG, which is the story, seems to be an afterthought and was underdeveloped. Now that we've looked at the completely, totally awful changes of the series, let's look at a couple of more changes. There were a few other items that were changed, but were limited to the combat screen and system that I don't feel really made too much of a difference myself. Each opponent had different stances that you would see as the enemy got weaker that showed their current HP amount to a certain extent. So there was a visual representation for when an opponent was getting weaker. Another item that was changed was the way that your character's HP was displayed. By default, instead of showing a numeric HD display, it showed a health bar. Though you did have the ability to decide which one to use, and I always ended up choosing the numeric display because I like mathematics, and they truly are mathematical after all. They also included the option to make your second character automatically select options and attacks during battle, though you could make their selections manual if you wanted to. While this is kind of a predecessor to the systems used in Final Fantasy XII and XIII, it was both good and bad, since the secondary character would always use the enemy's weakness instead on auto, and they would heal you when you needed it. But the backside of this was that they would waste every spell they had, and quickly. I honestly prefer to be in control of everything, so they are always set to manual when I play this game. Though I did say second character for a reason, since you will never have more than 2 people in your party at any given moment, and the second person will be one of 4 different people. Kaylee, the small town girl, Ruben, the mercenary, Phoebe, the archer, and Tristram, the ninja, I guess? Each one of them will be in your party at least twice during the game, as dictated by the story. Much like Final Fantasy IV, there is no real control in this aspect of the game. The last 2 items I need to cover that affected the gameplay and the combat system is the fact that there are no weapon shops. All of your equipment, your swords, your axes, everything will be found within the field, and there's only 3 of each. The actuality behind this is your character, the main character, Benjamin, will be able to walk through the game with 4 different weapons. And these 4 weapons will be upgraded each time, which you can easily choose which weapon you have equipped by pushing the L or the R buttons on your Super Nintendo controller. You can also change weapons within battle, so it's not a whole issue of having to go into an equip screen, such as in Final Fantasy IV, to change which weapon you have equipped. The spell system is also very similar to the weapon system. There are no spell shops, and you do not gain spells by leveling up. You find spells in treasure chests. Now each one of these items were done by design, as I said about an hour ago. The development team after seeing the lack of response to Final Fantasy IV, decided they wanted to try something new in an effort to pull in the US's money. This translated to the dev team to saying that all Americans want in a video game is something so simplistic and uninspired it would feel like Mario teaches typing and play about on the same level. Which sadly, after looking at the types of games that have become popular in the US...
No, because they are dead.
I said the humans are dead.
He's right, they are dead.
The humans are dead.
Sniff this one, it's dead.
We use poisonous gases
With traces of lead.
and we poison their asses.
Actually, their lungs. Binary solo.
0 0 0 0 0 0 1 0 0 0 0 0 0 1 1 0 0 0 0 0 1 1 0 0 0 0 1 1
Come on, sucker, lick my battery.
I really can't blame them for thinking that way anymore. This was intended to be a, quote, entry-level RPG, unquote. But when it was released, the critics panned it for being overtly simplistic. And in the end, it almost did more damage to the series' popularity than actually helping it in the US. And I can say for a fact that they wanted this game to boost the series' popularity. Just look at the ad campaign that they had for this game. You couldn't open a gaming magazine, whether it be Nintendo Power or Electronic Gaming Monthly, without seeing one, if not both of these ads within them. Though, yes, I do end up having agreeing that you will want a head lube and oil change once you complete this game. Especially when you see that the game will give you unlimited amounts of healing items just before the final boss. As to say, oh, you stupid American, you can't beat a real boss, so we will make this even easier for you. Though, take note of the giant $39.99 that is labeled here. There is a reason they emphasize that. Most games, especially RPGs, for the Super Nintendo were anywhere between $45 to $50 at the time on the release. So this was to say that, hey, you can actually afford to buy this one, so buy it! I say all of these things to come to one specific point. At this time in the history of Final Fantasy and video games, in general, there are two viewpoints when it comes to Mystic Quest. You either like the game or straight out loathe it. I will give two examples to this, one being me and one being another person. I played this game well after the Nintendo 64 had already been on the market because I didn't have that many games for the Super Nintendo and I did not own a Nintendo 64 because, yet again, my parents hated video games and what they thought it was turning me into, a fat lazy slob. Though, one day at Hastings, I guess my mom felt bad for me and offered to buy me a new, used Super Nintendo game. So I looked everywhere around that Hastings for a copy of Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy III, but all I could find was Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, a game I had heard of, but never heard how it was, whether it was good or bad, and I ended up buying it, because my 14-year-old mind said, I love me some Final Fantasy, so this should be good! So my mother ended up buying me that game, and the rest, they say, is history. I had already played games like Chrono Trigger at my friend's house, along with Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy VI, Breath of Fire, etc., etc., etc. So I was a fan of those types of RPGs, namely, well-built RPGs. That is why I don't like Mystic Quest. But if you talk to someone, say Nintendo Capri Sun, he likes the game because it introduced him to the series according to what he said during his Let's Play. That is the thing. Most of the people who experienced it as a gateway game look back with fond memories of nostalgia. But people who were already invested fans of the RPG genre loathe this game almost as much as they don't like Quest 64. Though it doesn't truly matter because this is only a side game in the series. For me, it's like that one-night stand that you have but end up regretting it the next morning because the alcohol told you a lie. Sometimes you just have to look back and say, yeah, lesson learned. I should also mention the soundtrack for this game for two reasons. The first being because I actually like the soundtrack, and I really have no complaints about it save for a couple of songs. One of the reasons is because the soundtrack is reactionary. When you first enter a town, you will hear its theme in one version, but after you have saved the town, the theme will change to mirror the fact that it has been saved. The other reason is because I don't have to mention this guy. For once, I don't have to mention him because it was actually composed by Ryuji Sasai and Yasuhiro Kawakami. Even though that one guy didn't end up staying away from Final Fantasy for very long, I have to say that Sasai and Kawakami did a fantastic job in emulating the atmosphere and mood in the game, along with the different dungeons you must fight your way through. It is a beautiful masterpiece. If you haven't listened to it, look up the songs on YouTube. You will not be disappointed. Before I end off, I want to point out a few items that can make this game even easier than it already is. When you first start the game and enter the first town, you might be saying to yourself, man, I wish there was an item store here so I could stock up on healing items, but damn it, there isn't! Here's a little trick for you in this particular situation. There are 2 treasure boxes in this town. One in this house right here, and another that requires the use of an axe to get to. And both contain 3 healing items. Collect both boxes, leave town and come back in. Those same boxes will now be restocked. So in essence, you can get 99 of these healing items before you ever enter the first dungeon of the game if you want to take the time. This trick will end up working for every town of the game because the code says, for this game, when you leave an area and you go back in, it is supposed to reset chests, enemies, and character placements. So go ahead guys, go have fun by creating yourself an infinite inventory. There is also a spell that has a total of 3 uses in the game. The Life spell can revive a fallen party member and will bring them back to full health. But did you know that you can also use that spell even if the target isn't dead and it will still restore them to full health anyway? Then if you're really bored, you can also use it to insta-kill any undead enemies, including the final boss of the game, which is the only time you can actually break the damage barriers of this game. Overall, while not the best game in the series, that is easily seen as the worst in the series, it still had a few lasting effects that were seen again, such as the auto combat system and the more linear paths, but overall it does not come highly suggested by me. I honestly find it quite strange that the game Square hoped would bring in the US market almost pushed away their limited lasting fanbase because of the design choices they made. It was a polarizing game, yes, but in a very bad way. If only Squaresoft could have predicted what the next game in the series was capable of, which we will cover next time. So this is the Professor, and once again, as always, I bid you all a very fine adieu. The last 2 things I need to cover that affected the changes to gameplay are even used climbs to claw. Mainly because I didn't have that many games from Super I honestly find it quite strange that the game Square hoped would bring in the US market almost pushed